It wasn't until 1997 that I met Kravtsov again. Our meeting wasn't deliberate, but I had a feeling that it wasn't accidental either. At the time, most of the secret work I used to do in the 80s and early 90s had concluded. The agencies had all been dissolved, along with the Soviet Union, and so there was very little secret work available on this side of the Atlantic. I worked in various institutions over the years, most of them run by the NHS. I did some studies on patients in Broadmoor for just under a year. Contrary to those who believe that it's a prison, it's actually a high security hospital. The only difference between it and any other NHS hospital was the absence of the patient's right to refuse treatment. Don't get me wrong, I never conducted evil, twisted experiments like you see in House on Haunted Hill or the horrors of Dr. Mengele in 1940s Germany. All of my experiments were psychologically based and intended to help patients regain as much of normal life as they possibly could. Officially, they could not refuse treatment, but I always gave my patients the chance to opt out whenever they felt like it. I was at a psychology convention in West London. It was on for a few days, so I was staying in a hotel near Stonebridge Park. You'll have to forgive me for not remembering the name of the place, but it was almost 20 years ago. One evening, I was in the bar right next to the conference center, talking to professors from other universities, when I heard him. "Comrade, over here!" It was Kravtsov. What was he doing here? An ex-Soviet military commander at a British medical convention? I excused myself from the group I was talking to. They exchanged some strange looks with each other when I seemed to respond to the calling of "Comrade." After all, I had never discussed what happened 7 years earlier with anybody. I walked over to Kravtsov. He was holding a brandy glass in one hand and had a smoking stub of thick cigar in the other. He was dressed differently from the last time I saw him. He certainly looked more like a civilian now. He no longer wore the dark green blazer adorned with multiple military medals on his chest. "Kravtsov, what are you doing here?" He had a surprised smile on his face. "Well, I'm not here for your psychological diagnosis, if that's what you mean." I was surprised at how human he seemed compared to the last time we met. I could only presume that the collapse of the USSR had lightened his mental workload. We sat down at a table on the less crowded side of the bar. "So, like I said, what are you doing here?" I asked him again. Well, I contacted your university, but they said you were no longer teaching there. So I made a few phone calls, greased a few wheels, and found out that you were going to be here for the next couple of days." It seemed like he had certainly made an effort to find me. My presumption that our meeting this evening was no accident was confirmed. "So, what are you doing now?" I asked him. "Well, when my mother Russia began to fall apart, I did what any smart man would do in that situation. I took advantage." He chuckled as he took another sip of his brandy. He could see the inquisitive look on my face. He put his brandy glass on the table, leaned forward, and continued to tell me. "Well, let's just say that some countries east of Europe but west of Russia was able to get a discount on surplus military hardware." He winked as he relit his extinguished cigar. "I was responsible for liquidating assets, mostly military hardware. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, weapons, ammunition. You get the picture. So my instructions were simple. Sell what you have for the best price you can get and forward the money directly to Moscow." It made sense to me. After all, what would the largest communist state want to do with hundreds of thousands of vehicles and hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition when it's in the process of falling apart internally? "I think I can guess what happened next," I told him. "Perhaps, but there's no harm in telling you anyway. So leaders from all over Eastern Europe and the Baltics could now buy the best military hardware in the world for a fraction of what it would cost for them to manufacture. But there was a problem: how to transfer the payment. Banks asked too many questions, even in Russia." Kravtsov took another sip of his brandy. I told him straight. I would only accept payments in gold bullion or US dollar bills. No compromise. The rest was simple. Paperwork was forged. Amounts changed. 100 tanks for $300,000 could so easily be changed to 700 tanks on the paperwork after the sale was complete. Suddenly, I had another 600 tanks at my disposal, which I could sell and keep the proceeds to myself. Weren't you afraid of being caught? I asked instinctively. Krapsov chuckled. Please, comrade. This was the fall of the Soviet Union, the biggest military power the world has ever seen. Yes, there were those who were supposed to keep tabs on things, but there was nothing an envelope of $100 bills couldn't fix. He flicked his hand at me, summoning me closer to listen to what he was about to say. Those who knew didn't care, and those that cared didn't know. We talked about politics and the fall of communism for a couple of hours before we ended up on the topic of the failed lunar mission in 1990. Suddenly, the jolly mood darkened despite the quantities of alcohol we had consumed. Comrade, if we are to discuss this topic, may we continue this conversation in private? I had to agree with him. It may have been the late 90s, but talking about top secret space launches in a public place would have raised a lot more eyebrows than the sight of two men going into the same hotel room. So we left the bar and we went back to my hotel room, which was a few minutes walk from the conference center. When we got back to my hotel room, he sat on the chair next to the television. I pulled the other chair from across the room and we sat opposite each other as we resumed our conversation from the bar. So what became of the missions? I asked him. I couldn't tell you everything we knew back then, comrade. He sighed with frustration. We should have never sent that mission up there. It felt wrong from the start, but how could I stop it? I was just a cog in the giant communist machine. I could understand his inability to prevent that. He certainly had remorse over it. After the mission in '68 failed, we made contact with what was behind the decimation of those two missions. My ears pricked up. I wasn't expecting him to say that. We had an open line of communication between the launch site at Kiza and them. Not the figures, they were just soldiers. No, this was much more real. So, what were they? I asked him. We don't know. They didn't understand our questions, but they communicated by the one true universal language, science. They had developed technology which was inconceivable to us at the time. Now, I don't know how much you know about technology, comrade, but I will break it down in simple terms for you. Before we made contact with them, we had little success in developing semiconductors. We sent them samples and plans explaining our problems with simple symbols, and they returned the solution. Sent? How did you send it? I asked. It's not as if they had sufficient radio bandwidth to send images to the moon and back. Probes. We sent many probes to the moon. Inside were samples of our failed semiconductors made of germanium. He continued as he walked over to the minibar and helped himself to another drink. They returned the probes with a solution to the problem. They suggested replacing the germanium with silicon. Also included were tiny quantities of chemical solutions which they suggested us to use to aid the photolithography process. These were so much more reliable than the stuff we were using before. Unbelievable stuff. We analyzed the samples and produced larger quantities of them. The process now worked flawlessly. I was amazed. I didn't quite understand all he was saying, but I understood the general idea of it. Whatever was up there was helping the Soviets develop higher technology. But, Krapsov continued, we knew we weren't the only ones being helped. Over the next few years, we had agents in the United States who provided us with samples of American semiconductors. The process was identical to the one provided to us by them. This was no coincidence. America had contact with them too? I asked him with no uncertain terms. Of course, but they use their technology to enrich their capitalist society, selling it to their general population in the new concept of gadgets and electronic computers. We, on the other hand, use that to enhance our society and our military power. It all started to fit together. The technological improvements over the past 50 years were extraordinary, too extraordinary for humans to complete unassisted. So, if they helped you advance your semiconductor industry, why were they so hostile? He sat back down as he answered me. Comrade, you must remember one thing. They're not afraid of us. They don't have the ability to feel fear, although they understand how they can use it against us. They do, however, have self-preservation instinct, as do all intelligent forms of life. I had to ask the question, even if I didn't want to hear the answer. So then, what did they want in exchange for this knowledge and scientific assistance? Krapsov leaned back in his chair as he tried to think of a way to word his answer. How to say this? I remained silent as I waited for him to reply. Well, they wanted to conduct experiments on the human mind. Don't assume they were asking for our permission. They didn't need any permission. They could do what the hell they liked. So what they wanted was our cooperation in allowing their experiments to walk among the rest of society and to minimize our interference. A chill ran down my spine as I asked him what sort of experiments they wanted to conduct. Psychological experiments, of course. They wanted to see the reaction of the general population when a small number of us are altered and allowed to remain physically unchanged. Krapsov started to look uncomfortable as he talked about the subject. He started pacing around the room as he talked. Let me ask you something, comrade. Do you believe in God? I hesitated before I answered honestly. No, I'm an agnostic. I'm open to the concept of organized religion, but I'm not entirely convinced by it. He pointed at me as he chuckled quietly. That, comrade, is a good answer. I felt slightly uncomfortable by this time. What does my faith, or lack thereof, have to do with extraterrestrial assistance in Soviet technology? Please continue. What's it got to do with religion? They had conducted experiments before which were hugely successful for them. They altered the psyche of a few people around our planet over the space of several centuries. People called them prophets. Suddenly, my mouth went dry and I started to sweat. Tell me you're joking, Krapsov. He lowered his tone of voice. This is no joke, comrade. I'm serious. I was brought up as a Catholic myself, and I've grown to accept the fact. I still wasn't sure whether or not to believe him. I don't think he was lying to me, but he may have been mistaken or interpreted it incorrectly somehow. Okay, so for the sake of this conversation, let's assume that all prophets... Krapsov interrupted me. Most, comrade. Most prophets. But not all of them were part of the experiments. We just don't know which ones. I continued my question. Okay, so let's assume that most of the prophets were part of the experiment. What are they going to do now? I mean, it's not as if they can create another religion. We have already had new religions in the past few hundred years, and they mostly failed because people are too set in their ways to accept a new belief system into their lives. Krapsov confirmed what I believed was true. You're right, religion is an old experiment. They know it was successful, you can see the results for yourself. What they want now is to experiment with, how could you say, anti-prophets. I didn't quite understand. I needed to know more. What do you mean by anti-prophets? Krapsov thought for a moment before he spoke. We don't know. We don't think they've started yet. At least that's what they told us. The concept of a known unknown from an extraterrestrial race was horrifying. Krapsov continued in a serious tone of voice. All we know is that they won't begin to experiment until our home planet completes 2,000 rotations around the sun after the birth of one of the prophets. It couldn't have been clearer if he had spelled it out for me in foot-high letters on my hotel room wall. So you mean to say they plan to conduct their new experiment after the year 2000? Bearing in mind that in 1997, the concept of the new millennium was generally exciting and invigorating. This gave a much more sinister prospect. I can only assume what they have planned, but if you want my opinion, they're going to turn small numbers of people against the rest of us, possibly using their previous experiment as a framework. However, because of how widespread the last experiment was and how many people find comfort in it, it will be almost impossible to isolate and eliminate. My mind was all over the place by now. I was trying to comprehend what Krapsov knew. So, what will be the outcome? I asked, not expecting a direct answer. Krapsov looked worried. I don't know. I just think that we need to be aware that the next time we are attacked, it will be by those from our own species. Not for land, money, or even freedom, but for a false ideology which was given to their ancestors several hundred years ago by the result of an experiment by extraterrestrial beings for reasons we can't begin to understand. After that point, the conversation drew to a close, but like all Russians, Krapsov didn't want our meeting to end on a low note. We talked about topics closer to home for the next hour or so, football, television, our families, and so on, before he saw my camera on the table and took an interest in it. At the time, I was a keen amateur photographer, so I took my camera to London with me even though it stayed in my hotel room the whole time. He asked me to take a photo of him. I don't usually take photos of people. Landscapes and architectures were more of my subject of choice. I took a few photos of Krapsov, we had another drink, and then he left. I remember him saying that he would like a copy of the photos next time we meet. I wish I had kept in contact with him. Back in those days, it was impossible to maintain contact with international acquaintances. Obviously, there was no Facebook or Twitter, and you can't just try to speak to every Krapsov you find in the telephone book. It's not as quite common as the English names Smith or Johns, but it's certainly not uncommon. Maybe it's more like the Russian equivalent of Wilson or Roberts? Sadly, I never saw Krapsov again.
I've been hating you inside of me, trying hard not to be myself. Been killing all emotion so I can sleep inside a void.